All right, welcome everybody. Today we're going to take a really quick look at creating a super simple modular asset that will then take out of Maya and bring into Unreal. There's a couple things that I want to point out in this particular tutorial just to kind of give you a heads up on how the scale and pivot point work when we're taking a look at something from Maya and translating that to Unreal. So let's go ahead and get started. So the very first thing I'm going to do here, I'm in Maya. I'm just going to create a super simple polygon object. I'm going to create a cube here, and I'm going to scale this cube up. Now, right off the bat, the main thing I want to look at here, again, I'm thinking about a modular asset. So this is going to be something that I'll be able to use over and over and over again inside Unreal to then build bigger and larger environments. So one of the easiest ways to start thinking about this is, if I'm in Unreal, I want to be able to snap at certain increments. So for example, if I have a cube that's 100 centimeters by 100 centimeters, I'll be able to snap at 50 values of 50. So in this case, what I'm going to do, I'm going to look at the scale on this cube. Quick way to do that, Control T, and that'll pop up my my measurement tool. I can hit T again just to get rid of that. I can also go into my attribute editor and take a look at the scale on this. And in this case, I'm actually going to make this 200 by 200 by 200. So I have a square, a cube, that is 200 in all dimensions. The other thing I want to look at here is my pivot point. So if you look at this, you can see that the pivot point is directly in the center of this object. And you might think, well, that's great, but I want to make a point here. So I'm going to pull this up to just above the ground plane here. So that's point of origin. In Maya, my point of origin is 0, 0, 0, right at the intersection of my grid there. And then my object now is placed well above that point. I do have a pivot inside that object set to the center of that object. So what's going to happen when we translate that from Maya into Unreal? So let's go take a look at that. I'm going to go ahead and grab this. That object is selected. If it's not in object mode, make sure you're right clicking and holding, and you can scroll over to object mode there if my mouse will let me do that. There we go. I'm going to go to File and Export Selection in this case. And what I'm going to look for, I'm going to find the folder that I want to drop these into, and I'm going to make a new folder here, and I'm going to call this Modular Demo, and inside there I'm going to save that file as an FBX, and I'm going to call this Modular 1. Now, make sure that the file of type is set to FBX, and then all I'm doing is I'm leaving smoothing groups turned on and smooth mesh turned on. The other thing I want to do, I'm going to make sure that my version is set to FBX 2018. And lastly, I don't need embed media in this instance, and I do not need animation because I'm just doing this as an example, but you might eventually turn embed media on later on if you're bringing through textures or something that you've built and you want to have that come with it. So I'm going to go ahead and export this selection. So now we're going to roll over to Unreal, and we're going to import that modular asset. I'm going to right click in my content window, and I'm going to go to Import Asset and come over to my modular demo and grab Modular 1 and import that. Now, my FBX import options, leave that all at default for right now. I'll come back through, I'll do another demo, another tutorial on all of the settings and all of the information that we need to think about when we're importing an FBX object. But in this case, everything set to default will be totally fine for what we're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and import that. Okay, so as soon as I do that, that populates into my content folder. If I drag that up and drop it into my space, to my game space, you'll notice it's hovering well above that ground plane. And why is that? Well, this is the one thing that I want to make sure you understand when you're translating from Maya to Unreal. The 000 point in Maya translates over to Unreal and becomes the pivot for whatever object you're bringing in. It sounds crazy, but Unreal doesn't care about where the pivot is on the object in Maya. All it cares about is where the 0 point is, the origin point. So take a look back here in Maya, you can see that the object pivot point is well above that 000 point, but when we get back to Unreal, that 000 point becomes the point of origin. So why does that even matter? Well, if I were to want, go in here and start to build something out modularly, I could technically come in and start to manipulate that and move that around, and it looks okay. It's starting to build and become modular because, again, I'm using a value of 200, and I have my grid snapping turned on, and I have that set to increments of 50. So every increment that I move, it will move in an increment of 50. So technically, I could come in here and start to build out modularly, but my anchor point is way down here. So what if I needed to then, again, think modularly. If I want to manipulate this and have a couple sides on this cube, I couldn't come in and really start to spin it around or manipulate it in any valuable fashion. So I would need to readdress where that pivot point is. So one of the main things we need to think about is when we're building modularity into our game assets, we need to think about how those are going to be utilized in the game engine and think about where a pivot point might need to live in order to give us the best usability across the board. So I would probably want that pivot to be in the center of the object, or a corner, or a bottom plane of the object. So how do I do that? Well, let's pop back to Maya and I'll show you really quick how to do that. So in this instance, I have my pivot on my object and it's directly in the center. So what I can do is I can hit the D key on the keyboard and simply click on a corner, and it aligns that pivot to the corner. Then if I hold the control key, I get an orient option. And in this case now I can click on any face or anything that I need, and it'll orient my directional handles to the correct orientation. So in this case that's fine for what we're doing right there. So now that pivot is set to the corner. However, if I were to bring this, just export this right now, I'd still have the same issue because my 0 point is way down here. So how do I fix that? Well, the fastest way to do it is simply turn on the snap to grids option, the top of Maya here. I can just pull this down and it'll snap to the grid, and just kind of manipulate this and move it around until I get that set to 000, and there it is. So now this pivot is at the 0 point. One thing I want to mention, if you look at the translation of my object, it's at 100, 100, negative 100. And why is that? Well, that's because my cube is 200, right? So I'm splitting that difference there. And then once I put it at the 0 point now, that is actually where the pivot is going to live based off of the original pivot point. Remember, it was in the center of the object. So how do I make this all 0? Well, one note I want to make, if I were to just export this now, File, Export Selection, I'll do this really quick so you can kind of see what'll happen. Modular 2, all the same settings as before. Right click back in Unreal, import Modular 2, and leave that all there. If I drop this in, you can see that for all intents and purposes here, that's working. It's in there. Because, again, back in Maya, it doesn't really care, Unreal doesn't really care where that pivot is. It just needs to know where that point of origin is, that 000 point. However, if I want it to be real tidy, I could freeze the transformations here. So, for example, I go to Modify, and freeze transformations, and now everything's translated back to 0 here. So that is my 0 point, and there we go. I'm at 0. I can move this guy around now, and if I need to get it back to 0, I can simply just type in translate 0, 0, 0, and that'll pop right back in. That's a little bit more of a housekeeping kind of tidy thing. So if I were to put my pivot where it needed to be and then manipulate it and move it around, I can go back to zeros and it'll be all good. So let's pop back into Unreal. I just want to show you why this is a big deal. So again, as I mentioned, I can kind of come in here, and because I have that set to increments of 50, can manipulate that and move that around and really start to build a really great modular kind of environment here. Do something really fast. Do. One more. There we go. And I'm going to pop on a material here so you can kind of get an idea of what the big deal is. And I could have done this on the very first one and then just duplicated from there, but I was ahead of myself just to show you how that works. I'm going to pop these guys in here. And one more. There we go. So look at this. You might be thinking, yeah, big deal. So what? That's fine. But watch what happens if I pull that up. So if for some reason you're building modular assets and the snapping isn't working correctly, and let's say it's really hard to kind of get things snapped together and you're getting overlapping faces, you might run into an issue where you're starting to have this little bit of funkiness happen. So you're getting this kind of shimmery kind of effect. And that's really going on because you are getting an overlapping surface. And we do not like that, right? So we want to make sure that when we build modular assets, we're thinking about that ahead of time. And that looks fine. That looks great there. Now again, you notice the way that I did it originally, it works, right? It's still working. However, the thing that we have to contend with in this case is that the pivot point is not in the right location. We'll go over a couple other processes here of creating a moving the pivot point in Unreal, but for right now, I just wanted to kind of give you that little heads up on how to create a modular asset and a couple other things to keep in mind as you're doing that. All right, real quick bonus. I mentioned the fact that you could change or alter the pivot in Unreal so that you could kind of work on an object that maybe has a pivot that's off of center or something like that. So let's see how we do that. Easy, super easy. All you got to do, hold Alt, middle mouse click, and there you go. Look at that. You can move the pivot. Now you might be thinking, well, Dave, you just did that, all that stuff, and now it doesn't even matter. Well, it does matter because watch this. And so my pivot's moved, but then, oh, look at that. As soon as I click it and move it, it moves the pivot back to the initial starting point. So I have to then adjust that and change the pivot every time I need to work on that object, which becomes a real hassle. Versus right here where I have this object, and now if I wanted to rotate this guy, I could simply rotate it around to where I wanted it to be and manipulate that and put that back into place. And it's just a little bit easier to do than having to change that pivot every time. So again, that's a little fun bonus for you guys. Thank you very much and have a great day.